So Brian, thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. It's fabulous to actually be in the gallery at last. I was just thinking that it was maybe 2 years since we spoke about this, but you've just said that it's actually 3 years, which is incredible. And I guess due to the pandemic and the nature of how things have spun out, this is where we are now. But I was thinking just this morning that it's kind of interesting in a way, because never in the past 2 years or so have we been so tracking time and so conscious of the nature of time gone by. And your work is essentially about that relationship to time. And within this show, I think what I'm looking at is this exploration of that through kind of two devices. One is the practice of drawing and the medium of drawing, and the other is how you bring in other artworks and other artists from the past to kind of speak about time. Do you want to talk a bit about how you came upon those two kind of strategies of looking at time?
Yeah, I've long been interested in drawing's relationship to time, and when I sort of made that, my background is as working as a painter. And I was working, but I was really dissatisfied with what I was doing, painting. So I did my MA in the 1990s in Belfast. And I said, OK, I'm going to strip everything back and I'm going to think about what is it that interests me most in the notion of image making and art making. And it was line. I just began to think about line. And then just the notion of tracking a line over the course of a piece of paper. I thought, so the line is this self-archiving event. It records its own self through time. It doesn't have to refer to anything else. So I threw myself into thinking around systems-based art practices and 1960s classic wit and Hannah Darboven and this kind of work, which I found really rich and rewarding. And it sort of literally cleansed the palette of colour and of tonality. So it just stripped everything back to line. And I began to sort of work with line through that sort of serial-based practices, working within sort of geometric shapes and forms and overlapping patterns, and thinking about systems-based music and Steve Reich and those kind of things. And I took titles from musical terms like adagio and lento and things like that, which spoke to the way I was making the drawings, not in a sense trying to depict what was happening in those sort of musical scores. But I kind of became dissatisfied with that it was a bit too. It was like a closed-loop system. It was just the drawing and the activity of drawing was only referring through time of its own construction. It didn't have another register. So I began to break that line up, and I started using it as Morse code. So I did a collaboration with a composer. He had a show in the Project and the Context and West Cork Art Centre. So we toured this idea of the Morse code, which had its origins in fine art, as Samuel Morse was a painter.
Right.
So it was this notion of a visual language. And then suddenly for me, the drawn line was referring to something outside of itself. It had this other history towards some notion of obsolescence and Morse and music and sound. And it began to feel better that relationship was sitting, it was in the drawing, but it was outside the drawing as well. And as that went on, I began to look at paintings. And there was, I think it was Hockney and Falco's book, Secret Knowledge, came out. And there were these amazing reproductions of artists who had they felt used projection. And there was a particular one of a close-up of the Mona Lisa. I mean, cheesy start. And I just thought, oh, look at the line here. So the line is made by time, and it's the erosion and the plate tectonic movement on the surface of the painting is causing the line.
Of the Mona Lisa.
Of the Mona Lisa.
Right.
So you get the craquelere patterning on the face. So I thought, well, if you drew that and you took away the image, what would that do? So that brought me back into artwork and thinking about artwork as having particular relationships to time. And so I pursued the notion of those sort of cracked drawings for quite a while, changing scale and instead of having intimate little ones and then ones that would be like 3 meters by 2 meters, these quite large ones.
And you still stuck with pencil and paper.
I mean, I always thought of that as a kind of like a holding position, that is going to move on sometime, but that's 20 years ago now.
Because it is quite, there's not that many artists that I'm aware of at least who really use drawing as their core medium and drawing using pencil and paper as well, So it's quite interesting to think about that and think about I mean, you know, you've done a couple of different interviews around the show as well, and conversations, and I suppose what the most obvious thing is that the fragility of pencil on paper is really apparent, and that's the medium that you use to talk about time and disintegration of previous works. So is that like, I'm sure that's conscious, but was it conscious the whole time of like how you...
Certainly not at the start, because I suppose
Yeah.
I was still on that notion of trying to, you know, clear out stuff I felt wasn't working for me within the practice. So
Yeah.
I suppose you start somewhere with a hunch, and you see where it takes you. As I went on and I began thinking about drawing's position in relation, because I was mainly looking at painting. I suppose the drawing comes before the painting. It has this provisional thing. So I quite liked the notion of the conceit that the drawing is the response to a painting, or it's a response to another sort of scientific image, because I began to look at X-rays and infrareds and technical analysis of an artwork, because they begin to show you different levels of time. They don't show you just the surface that we encounter, which we see the cracked spaces of, or the speckled watercolour and gouache that we see in this show. But there is a compression of time takes place in an X-ray, where you see the stretcher and the frame and the canvas and the weave and the image and the underpaint and the underdrawing, and all that becomes sort of equalised. So there's something then about that analogue pursuit of drawing with the pencil seemed to fit in terms of those image making, because when an X-ray or an infrared is done, I mean, there are colour versions of infrareds which are sort of beautiful, but for the most part they're tonal, and it seemed to fit right in terms of where I was going, in terms of thinking around drawing as being shifting for me from just being a kind of linear based thing to sort of a tonal activity. I mean, 20 years, big shift. I've moved from line to tone.
Congratulations.
Who'd have thought?
But it's also like the likes of infrareds, and it's about this kind of technological objectivity and scientific thought. But drawing is incredibly human and intimate, and you know, tracks the mood as well of the drawer.
Yes.
Too. So it kind of takes something that might be more scientific and objective and brings it almost to more human or poetic realm slightly, I think.
I think that's really important. I suppose drawing always carries with it its own history of the autographic mark, and that there's some sort of authenticity around a drawn line when you put it down on a page, that, you know, it's like a seismograph or a cardiac reader, or, you know, that it has such a strong relationship to the body. And I think for me, there was that interesting relationship, as you're saying, through that, because sometimes people talk about my work as being forensic, and I never think of that at all. I mean, I look and I try and scrutinise, but it's with a view that they're imperfect. I mean, Via Selmans has the lovely term, she says, but when she was asked about why did she use scientific images, she says, well, I re-describe them into drawing. And I do feel the way that these things are re-descriptions, that that you are in the drawing when you're drawing it. And I hope for me that there's a kind of like an invitational position in that for somebody who's looking at the work.
So thinking about your work and looking at the works in the show, and also mainly Gelat's work, which is, you know, a core part of this exhibition, which we'll speak about in a moment. But the work is human-sized in a way, and a lot of the work about Manie as well, it comes across as a portrait of her work and a portrait of herself as well. But on a kind of wider vision of your practice, it's also, you know, you're always looking at sort of like the skin and the surface of an object or a painting, and looking not at the image itself, not at the image where you would be transported and get lost in, but on the surface of it, and looking at how that degrades over time. And I guess as a person, you know, we inevitably age and degrade. So there's this kind of, you recognize a part of yourself in your work, because you experience that too. And I know I talked to you before about, you were talking about in the past in your practice, you've referenced Frankenstein as well, and this like transformation, this ability to transform your body. So I think those kind of things are super interesting when you look at particularly like works that very specifically reference like Manie's work and those paintings, that the surface. Do you want to talk a bit about that? And
yeah, I sometimes the scale is defined by the original artwork.
Yeah.
That's what I normally did. And I'd done a lot of work on Vermeer.
Yeah.
And they were obviously transportable Dutch 17th century paintings for domestic. They were pitched at a domestic audience, therefore their scale was domestic. And it kind of gave me the rigour of having this one-to-one relationship with the original piece.
Yeah.
And that in a way, the drawing is a kind of like a surrogate of the original in a sense, if it has that sort of one-to-one relationship. And there's something about the reenactment of other people's marks that became apparent for me too, because they're on a one-to-one scale. So in a way, whether it's the original artist that you're there and you're conscious of those particular marks that were made, or when I began to do some more research on it, the marks of the restorer and the conservator, who paid this amazing attention to colour and tonality and texture and surface. Yeah. And so a lot of my work has been about reenacting original marks by the artist, but another strand of it has been reenacting marks of the conservator and the restorer, which are these sort of invisible traces that are left. So that made me think more about the body, I think. So like in relation to what you're saying there, those things like the Frankenstein images, and I did an unerased Rauschenberg's de Kooning, bringing back other sort of bodies, revealing those. Some of it is about my own aging, I think, and, you know, bouts of ill health or whatever, that make you think and reflect on, you know, yourself in time. And I think I did a show in 2018, and it was think about adaptation and change and alteration. So Frankenstein and Rauschenberg and the conservators' work on the Cimabue crucifixion and things. So that begins to think around the fading of the image, but also the fading and the reconstitution of the structure of an artwork itself. And I think that's one of the things that really hit me about Manie Jellett was during the run of the postponing and rescheduling, as we've all been doing for so long, I had the opportunity to see her studio. And that kicked off a relation that further sort of embedding that idea of her body in space, and in that space making these kind of works, speaking to, because it was a domestic room, it was a lovely domestic, large scale, obviously Georgian room, but still a domestic scale. So there was something around that made a lot of sense to me then about these 4 small paintings, which are decidedly domestic in their scale. But there's something around that notion of adaptation that hasn't left me still. And I had a chance to see some transcripts of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, because she wrote it first and then readapted it herself 20 years later. So there's lovely, actually it was in the Morgan in New York, I saw her reworking, you know, adding in bits of pages and overwriting text and overlapping things. That was such a sort of graphic drawing process that Frankenstein series seemed to make sense. I suppose then it was thinking about Jellett's body in space and working on these particular surfaces that you're aware that there is a sort of dialogue. So if you keep things on a one-to-one scale, you're acknowledging the original creation of those sort of pieces.
And related to that idea of kind of destruction and reconstruction and conservation, there was one work in particular, when we talked a couple of weeks ago, Da Vinci gunshot repair, is it in 2007?
Yeah.
And I was really struck. But you want to describe first what that is?
Sure. I came across a lot of my sort of image sourcing and all. It's obviously a huge strain around art history, but it's a lot of like National Gallery London's technical bulletin and you know, books around conservation and restoration. And when I started looking at this, I found a book called The Art of the Conservator. It's a rather beautifully po-faced book on everything from ceramics through to this, the Burlington cartoon, which was a large-scale Da Vinci drawing that was used to transfer to, I think it was Saint Anne and the Virgin, with Jesus and John the Baptist as children. And people might know it famously as there's a hand up pointing like that. And I think it was in 1987, a Falklands vet who was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder shot the painting and was arrested. So the immediate thing, obviously, was to restore the painting. But the painting was on paper, and it was quite a cloth-based paper. So I was interested in the act itself of a gunshot, which takes sort of milliseconds. Yeah. And then it was a 3-year project to replace all the fibres and knit that back into the original drawing. So there was never an intention that that act would remain visible.
Yeah.
The purpose of the conservation practice was to make that invisible.
Yeah.
So that notion of when we see an artwork, what are we seeing, I think is kind of really important. So it's okay for certain historical moments to remain visible on something and other ones not. But it was also the speed, it was the contrasting speed that you can do something like that and then somebody, it's their job for 3 years to take that away. So I was, in a sense, I mean, some of it was trying to understand the nature of that process. So my drawing was a small tonal drawing of the conservation process as it was happening, as they were actually knitting together the fibres of the paper for the gunshot wound. So it radiates out. It's almost like a spider's web, nearly.
But what's amazing is that you can really, your eye can track those lines, you know, to the centre of the impact. And it really does describe that moment of intensity and that destructive moment. And then this incredibly slow. And it's also your drawing would take so much time as well. So it's the conservation that took 3 years, and then it's your drawing again. And like you say, you know, uncovering what the conservation has hidden behind. And these ideas, I guess, of hierarchy, of, you know, the act of the impact on the surface of a work. And I also like that idea of hierarchy to do what we mentioned before, like the actual image and the usual stance of a painting and the image is to get lost in it. And this drawing attention to the surface, you know, stops you from getting lost in it. And it makes me think of Niamh O'Malley's film called Nephin, where on the lens, you know, she's tracking around the Nephin Mountain in Mayo and she has this blot on the lens. So you're going between these 2 layers and 2 completely different images and consciousness of like the lens as opposed to getting lost in the film. And it's very similar in your work, I think, you know, this consciousness of the damage on the surface and the image underneath.
Because I think we can self-edit or self-select when we're looking at these sort of damaged paintings. I think I do, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this, that if you look at something that's damaged, your initial impulse is to fill it. You know, to kind of perceive the thing, to have this sort of speculative reconstruction of a thing, be it a fragment or a detail that's missing or whatever. So we can oscillate that, or if there's like a cracked surface on a painting, like a Holbein or something, like we might imagine the person depicted without the material entropy. And then we see the entropy, and I don't know what the sort of, you know, the physiological reasoning for that. If it's one of those, what is it, sort of duck-rabbit things, we can't see both at the same time. You know, but I think it's a really interesting relationship, you know, between our willingness to accept what an image is, but then our willingness to accept that in the most cases the image is constructed through a set of, you know, materials, be it a projection or be it in Niamh's case, like the dot on the lens, let's say, whatever, that it sort of opens up that relationship for us in thinking about how something was made, why something was made, what time does it belong to, the time of our encounter in relation to that work, the time the work speaks to. So all those things just seem to present themselves. When it comes to that.
It complicates the you know, you go from work to work looking at, you know, typically in a gallery, if it's a kind of painting or pictorial landscape, getting lost inside it, coming out. And I'm even thinking of the largest work in the show, which works with the frame. So, you know, often you look at the painting and you're aware of the frame, but you're focusing in, whereas that starts to talk about the frame as part of the work and a kind of a bigger picture.
Yeah, I think for most people involved with yes, I think for most people when you're working on paper, you have to deal with the thorny issue of framing and what that means. And sometimes there are practicalities around something if it's transported or touring or hugely fragile or whatever, and that it's fragile and you make the decision to preserve it or protect it or conserve it. Therefore, you frame it. But I was just thinking then about my own relationship to framing, and that for the most part, I work in rectangles and then I put it in another rectangle, and that rectangle is made of glass and wood and card.
Yeah.
And I think with the chance to do the large drawing that I got this year, it was thinking about how could I change that relationship, that the frame doesn't have to in any way follow the dimensions of the piece itself. I mean, again, I think I come very slowly to things, maybe because the image construction is quite slow, so the thought process can be quite slow.
It's a nice way to work, though.
Yeah.
Especially things get faster.
I think so. I mean, that's another whole trope within drawing about the notion of the slowing down of an image. For me, it's more about attention, I think, than
focus and
in that way.
Yeah.
So then I was just thinking around that. I got some frames made up that I wasn't going to put anything in, because I was just looking at them as sculptural objects.
Okay, cool.
Just got them about the size of what we have here.
Yeah.
So I got, actually, as part of this show, I got four frames made up at the dimensions of the 4 gellets.
Right.
And I don't know what I'm going to do with them.
Okay.
But they springboarded me to think about that large piece.
Yeah.
And then I began to look at Gellett's sort of didactic diagrams on how to, create cubist images and all these sort of overlapping triangular shapes.
Yeah.
And I had them up in the studio for a long time, and I just began to kind of cut them up a little bit. And I thought, they look like frames. If you take the edges of these beautiful little diagrams, they could act as frames. And then that's what led. So I got the opportunity to work on this 3 metre by 1.4 metre drawing. And the hanging device, to me, is almost a drawing. And then I've added a work on paper onto this wooden frame of drawing. So part of me is thinking, maybe the frame could be the drawing, and I don't need anything else. So it's another form of construction. So I suppose in thinking about that relationship of framing, it's the first time I've gone sort of more sculptural in thinking. Before, I had something framed and it was doubled and it was placed perpendicular to a wall. So you had one image one side, one image the other. You couldn't see both at the same time. And there was an upturned infrared of a Vermeer, and then a standard view of the same infrared. And one you see a woman and the other you see a man, because whoever painted it, and it's questionable it was Vermeer, had overworked the painting.
Yeah, right.
But you couldn't see the same two things. So that was the first kind of sculptural piece I had, because it came out perpendicular. And I think there's something in that still, without kind of getting into some form of tricksy formalism. It wouldn't interest me, but maybe there's something around it can create another narrative and create another reading of what's constituting a drawing. So that's where the research is going a little bit at the moment. Just to think about that.
And what was the process like of, because it does jump from these more human scale to slightly larger format, and the role of the paper kind of hints that it could continue on, you're not sure how long for. But the process of working at that bigger scale, what was that? What does it feel like? I mean...
It felt cramped in the studio that I have.
Okay.
That was the first thing. And I could never see the whole drawing as I was working it, which is bonkers. But
you get the surprise when you hang it in the gallery.
Yeah, literally yes.
Yeah,
literally yes. And then the frame was constructed somewhere else and it was pieced together without me being there because of COVID.
Right.
So then I just began to see images that were sent from the gallery where it was first shown.
Yeah.
So that was sort of terrifying, in one way, just on the practical level. In the construction of it, it's more free-form than the other drawings, those Ether series drawings, which are a one-to-one relationship to those little entropic speckling that appear on the Gellett's abstract from 1937. So it was more kind of improvisational, but everything, all the dots that appear on that large drawing, they're all done in proportion to the speckles. So they're increased by 4 times, 2 times, 1 time, all this kind of thing. But it was more improvisory, moving around it, and it felt very bodily, that I wasn't inhibited by the original scale. I was happy for myself conceptually that there was a relationship there, just even formally through the proportions and the ratio. But it was much more embodied way of working. And when I first started doing the crack drawings, I had done quite large ones as well. So it was kind of revisiting size and scale. So I think, again, you know, you look at takeaways, I think that's a takeaway that I'd like to do. I did a one-to-one image of an X-ray from Rembrandt, which is about like 2.5 meters by 1.4 meters. That was really enjoyable to do. And I think, I mean, some of it is to do with one's own body, you know, at different times. But I would definitely like to play with scale now in a different way. And a piece like that makes me think about the sort of the choreography of drawing, you know, in that way, and how one moves and what the record is of that movement.
It completely changes.
Yeah. And speeds of drawing is something else I want to really think about too. Obviously, with a lot of the work in this show, it's very much a kind of slowing down. But I'm just wondering now about how I could think about moving that up a little, you know, and just changing different ratios. I'm always jealous of people or envious of John Latham's 3-second drawings.
Yeah,
you know, you just drop something.
I used to love. It was one of my favourite things, you know, the life drawing sessions in college, and you'd literally get like 5 seconds to make a drawing.
Yeah.
It's so freeing, you know?
Absolutely, and the blind drawing and all those exercises.
Blind drawing was great.
But I think what they all speak to are around the notion of time and expectation in a drawing. So if you were doing a drawing for 5 seconds, like you have a different expectation than if you had 50 minutes.
Yeah, totally.
And so I think sometimes when that notion of the reduction of time in drawing is that it removes the sort of photographic impulse, and that's such a good thing, says the guy who works in photos. But do you know that it's not like, because people feel still there is that barrier around drawing that, you know, unless I can illusionistically reproduce something with great sort of truth and veracity and accuracy, then I can't draw. And it is still because I've been teaching drawing for about 20 years now, and it is a disposition that's just so ingrained.
Yeah, it's amazing that it still doggedly continues, you know. But it's partly, I'm sure, due to school and secondary school and the type of a primary school, the type of thinking around that, and the majority of what people think is a good drawing, you know, it's still remarkably narrow focused.
Yeah,
you know?
You do get rewarded for levels of representational accuracy. You know, and you know,
I suppose people want to feel like they understand something, you know, and if they see something that's relatively simple to get, then they feel like, you know, I get it.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's
you
true.
want to be confused.
But sometimes it feels like if you were to equate it with writing, it'd be like that you just wrote a description versus you wrote maybe a more, let's say, a poetic description or a different form where you're leaving spaces between things, you know.
But I think your work, particularly in this show, is slightly deceptive in that way, because you're sort of reeling people in with these representational images. Other shows as well, even the Vermeer as well. But it's that there's something else going on, and I guess you can be willing to engage in that when you look closely, or you can, you know, keep it as a more, you know, surface reading, literally surface reading.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's really true. I don't know how much of that is intentional or how much of it is just my own sort of slow meandering in terms of looking at images as sources. And certainly Gellett came more into this show as sort of the photographic sources of Gellett became. And I think that happened over the slow nature of almost, this has been going on for nearly 3 years, this show. And I think before, when I first started, it was thinking around that sort of material engagement, you know, and think about the entropy and the dotting, and maybe working out different systems and processes around that.
And those systems and processes you followed some of Gellett's systems and processes.
Yeah, the rotation and translation technique that they worked with Albert Lowe and Albert Glaze. And they published on this, and she lectured on this. And there's a fantastic show up in the Ulster Museum called Rotation and Translation. Anna Leishing curated it. And it was a particular way. So it allowed me, again, to kind of acknowledge the source. It wasn't so much as looking at what the outcome of that was, but it was using the processes or the sort of engines that they used. And to take that process but apply it to one's own concerns. So like that, worked for me quite. It fitted well into that sort of material engagement with these things, with these 4 paintings as objects. But then she began to come more into it, and I began to think around what I'd never done before was thinking about the chronology or the biographical time of the artist, and I just hadn't looked at that. And maybe because she's Dublin, and maybe because I'm living in Dublin, and the historical distance isn't what it would be with Vermeer or Rembrandt or, you know, Keaton. So the relationship sort of changed then, and it seemed really important that she began to kind of come into it. And then the fortuitous thing of meeting some of her family and getting to see her studio and have conversations in the space that she worked in, and sitting in the chair, you know, beside the fireplace of an image that I had been looking at and was wanting to draw. And some of the objects that were in the original photograph were still in the house. You know, it just kind of collapsed and compressed time. And seeing the domestic scale that she worked in, it seemed to be that she should come more into the show. And I mean, just on a very practical level, I didn't really know what she looked like. I knew the work, but I'd seen 1 or 2 photographs of her at openings, you know, stand beside Gerald Dillon, and she looked this amazing, formidable person. But the more I began to research it, and the more images from her family and the different stages in her relatively short life of 47, it just seemed imperative in the work that the chronology of her life begins to put into it.
And as I think you said before, so that, you know, makes the show have these many levels of time.
Yeah.
You know, the autobiographical time, but also the materiality of time. Just lots of layers.
Yeah, because when the first impetus for this whole show wasn't going to be focused around Gelet at all. It was, I was going to look at because I live out here, and the nature of Dunleary through time, and it's all space and the marine and the ocean and marine time and all these sort of things. So it was like looking at my concerns, but trying to map them out into Dunleary. And then I said, well, I look at the collection and see are there other works that are present in the collection that I could maybe speak to, or whatever. And then it was just there's something around these Gelets sort of hung on, because I'd never looked so intensely at her work before, and sort of in my own art background or education, it was always felt that, you know, third-rate modernist and nothing innovative and, you know, bland internationalism and all this kind of stuff, just from the era that I was getting my sort of undergrad from.
Right.
But there was something in them that sort of just held my attention, and the sort of modesty and humility of these 4 little works on paper. And that just changed the thinking. So, I mean, I still think there's ideas of natural time and biographical time and all these, and, you know, material time and entropy, and they're all there, but they just, her sort of beguiling pieces just held that focus and kind of stripped away so many other things. And that was a really exciting moment, because I kept coming back to them, even though I didn't, you know, said, well, no, I won't. Well, I'm not going to do those, you know. So it was the little tension of, you know, am I going to go there or not? Am I going to go there or not? Yeah, I think it was. And then, like, at different times, the Arts Office were great, because I got access to see them, and we took them down off the walls, and we photographed the backs of them. I saw labels from Imma from 1992, from her big show. And I was going to draw the backs of them, you know, and do all these kind of things around their objectness and all. So I feel that I've lived with these 4 paintings for about 3 years now, even just in the studio.
You ready to let go?
I don't know. I actually don't know. Well, like, on the one hand...
We'll see what comes next.
Yeah, I mean, I think what it has got me really interested in is it's just, I suppose, so we're 2021, 22... high modernism, 1922, I suppose, like the Wasteland and Ulysses and Gelet's showing of early paintings in Dublin, and so all these things are sort of beginning to register. So there's something around that modernist moment that I think is sort of interesting. We're in this really strange time at the moment, and there's something I really find really attractive about their sort of utopian ideals. And the sort of positivity of progress.
Some utopian ideas right now.
There is a bit. I mean, and there is that sort of. I mean, obviously, when we're looking back with hindsight, there is that sort of hauntological look, and that we're in their future.
Yeah.
And, you know, are we lamenting the futures that they didn't,
Yeah.
that didn't happen for them and all this kind of thing, you know? And not being all tragic and morose. I mean, I actually find that really enlivening that there was these emboldened positions
Totally.
that took place. And I think, you know, maybe, you know, Mainie and I will, you know,
Travel
consciously
forward.
uncouple. But I think there's something still around the modernist moment that's really interesting me. And I have a chance to work with the Albers Foundation next year.
Brilliant. Yeah.
So particularly taken by some of Annie Albers' drawings for her weaving and loom work and some of his studies for paintings, these sort of unfinished studies. So I think there's something around their engagement with that sort of, you know, sort of, well, I suppose they're like icons of modernism, I suppose. That's the European modernism, you know.
We look forward to seeing what happens. And for now, thanks again for asking me all those years ago to come here. It's brilliant to see the work and to see it again before it goes. So well done and congratulations.
And thank you, Rachel.
All
Thanks.
right. Thanks, Brian.